Alok, welcome to your new post, and thank you for appearing today. Might you identify yourself for the sake of the record? I will ask Neil to do the same, and then Alex will begin the questioning.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for inviting me today. I'm Alok Sharma. I'm the Minister of State for Employment at the Department for Work and Pensions.
Hello again, I'm Neil Couling. I'm the Director General and Senior Responsible Owner for Universal Credit.
Brilliant. Alex?
Thanks very much. Minister, welcome.
Thank you.
One of the things that we as a committee are looking at is the interaction between self-employment and universal credit. I was wondering if you wouldn't mind explaining to us what the rationale behind assessing self-employed earnings on a cash-in, cash-out monthly basis is.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Burkhardt, for that question. If I may just say, Chairman, that I'm very pleased to be here. It's obviously my second week in the role.
You're a long-term occupant there.
Indeed.
Don't worry, we can tell you everything.
We'll see how long. But I just wanted to sort of reflect on the fact that I know we will have many conversations over the coming months. The one thing I can assure you of is that I will reflect on everything that your committee says, and I know there's a lot of experience on this committee. We won't always share the same view on everything, but I will absolutely reflect on it, and I want this to be a conversation and a dialogue between us, rather than just me turning up and giving you a set of answers. So just going back to the point that Mr. Burkhardt raised, I think in terms of the principle of universal credit, it is about making sure that we help more people into work, to get the right level of income, and thus, of course, helping both people who are employees but also the self-employed. The reason that we have done this on a monthly basis is because that is the way universal credit works, and that is the same for people who are self-employed as well as those who are employees. Now, it is entirely possible there will be some people who are partly self-employed. They will also be getting income from a job that they may be doing, and so I think the whole point of this is to sort of simplify the system, and you know at the end of every month what you are due. I know there's been a call to see whether we could do this as with tax credits on an annualised basis, but I would just point out that within tax credits, of course, there was a significant amount of overpayment and underpayment and adjustments to be made. So at the end of the day, this is a policy decision that we have taken.
So, and this sort of brings us on to the issue of the minimum income floor. We took some very interesting evidence last time from a farmer, from someone who was in the entertainment industry, who had very fluctuating incomes throughout the year, and because of the minimum income floor, were going to be left worse off at the end of the year than they would have been if they'd had a steady income. This doesn't seem entirely fair to the committee. As a new minister, does it seem fair to you?
Well, I think in terms of universal credit, what we have tried to do as a policy is to make sure that we're providing support also for those who are self-employed to grow their businesses. So the National Enterprise Allowance, of course, has been expanded since April last year to make sure that those who currently are self-employed and are not reaching their NEF level are able to get mentoring support to with their business plan. And I do accept, though, there will be examples, I'm sure, where people are not getting the same amount as if they were employed by an employer. However, I do think lots of people will make rational choices, and actually if you're a business person, you are constantly looking to see how you may improve and increase your earnings, and actually the opportunity to sit down with a business mentor and talk about how you may be able to expand in the fallow months. I mean, you raised the issue about a farmer, in the fallow months, how you raise your income. I think that is a provision that we now have available to people.
Thank you. And Neil, when the minimum income floor was set,
yes,
how did the department go about deciding where it should be?
So the minimum income floor is set at effectively the point at which you leave full conditionality if you're an unemployed person in the system. So it's set at a multiple of 35 times the national minimum wage over 52 weeks, then divided by 12 for the monthly assessment period.
And
I just want to ask on that point, what analysis or study of people who are self-employed was conducted to take you to that figure? Because the evidence we've had suggests that's a very untypical figure, and I assume you modelled it on something.
Well, if I may answer that, Mr. McCabe, in terms of the figures that are available to us, we know from the Family Resources Survey done in 2014-15, which was produced by the ONS, that on average self-employed workers are earning £10,800 and employees on average £20,000 a year. And as I said, the whole point of universal credit is to make sure that people are able to increase their earnings, given whatever limitations that they may have. And whilst we don't have a direct correlation, because the number of people self-employed within universal credit is actually a pretty low number right now, there was a report that was produced in September last year. It was called Self-Employment Working Tax Credit Claimant Survey, and Ipsos Mori were involved in talking to a representative group of people who are self-employed in tax credit. And I think what they found was that 79% of those people were earning £1,000 or less per month. And what they also found that 46% of these self-employed individuals had been in that role as self-employed for more than 5 years. So I think if you look at that analysis, what that suggests is that a large cohort of people who are self-employed on working tax credits actually have quite low levels of income. And I think that the aim of universal credit is, of course, to assist people, but also to be fair to the taxpayer. And that's why we have set the base at the national living wage.
Minister, I'll certainly look at the report if we can get access to it.
Yes,
I think
absolutely.
that would be helpful. But what I was really trying to understand was whether the 35 multiplier, if that was an assumption or a prediction. I mean, the report is a kind of retrospective look. I was just trying to figure out how you arrived at that decision in the first place.
So we've linked it to the kind of conditionality requirements of an individual. So if you're not subject to conditionality requirements, in fact, one of your witnesses last week was very worried about the minimum income floor applying to her, and based on what she said to the committee, I don't think the minimum income floor would apply in her situation. So if you're required to work 16 hours a week, you've a child who is over the age of 3, the minimum income floor will be a multiple of 16 hours times the national minimum wage, 52 divided by 12. Similarly, if you've got care responsibilities, it might be set at 25 hours times the national minimum wage. So we looked at it that way. But if I could just reiterate what the Minister said here, because I think it's really rather important. The number of self-employed people who show up in the in-work poverty statistics, a quarter of people showing as in-work poverty are self-employed. And even within the tax credit cohorts, self-employed people are earning £2,400 less a year than people in employment. So the policy is designed to try and incentivise people towards employment where that's suitable for them.
Chair, I don't want to hijack this, but can I just ask one last thing on this? I'm struggling just to make sure I've understood how we've got here. Am I right in thinking that what that means is that the actual average earnings for self-employed are about 3,000 less than the minimum income floor? That's what we're being told. Is that accurate?
Yeah, self-employment is a cause of in-work poverty.
And that is the intention.
And that's what we're trying to deal with here.
Right, Alex, and then Emma.
Okay, so one of the things that was raised with us last week was that the reporting periods for self-employed people in universal credit are out of sync with HMRC and making tax digital reporting periods, and also that where you're asking sort of start-up businesses or young businesses to report on a monthly basis, you're actually creating quite a bureaucratic load for them. Can you talk us through the decisions that led to this point?
Yes, I'm happy to do that, and then Mr. Couling can perhaps come on as well. I think As we've said, universal credit has been designed as effectively on a monthly framework. And many years ago, Mr. Burkhardt, I was a company auditor, and I audited both very large companies but also small companies. Mr. McCabe, similar experience, I guess. And what certainly my experience of it was that the companies that were best managed were the ones that kind of knew what their earnings and expenditure were on a almost real-time basis. And certainly if you talk to many small business owners, they will tell you that they invoice during the month, perhaps at the end of the month. They need to pay their own invoices that they receive from their suppliers at the end of the month. So I don't think it is perhaps as onerous as it may appear. And we have, of course, sort of tested this. So when this was sort of launched, we had a survey of people who were using the system, and they told us that 85% of them found it easy system. We found that only 6% said it wasn't easy, and obviously we need to make sure that we assist those. But 37% of the people using the system were using it out of business hours, which suggests that they're comfortable with it. And if I can say to you that in December the stats were that 97% of people were reporting their earnings on time, that perhaps gives you a measure that actually for very many self-employed people, they do regard this kind of reporting on a monthly basis perfectly reasonable.
If I might just add as well, just one piece, because the Minister for Mr McCabe highlighted the September 2017 survey. It's research report number 54, but we'll send a copy to the committee, definitely. But at page 50, we actually asked the tax credit claimants about monthly reporting, and they reported back to us that monthly reporting is not a problem for most, it's a direct quote from the report, because they compile records monthly. So we're confident about this.
Thank you.
So I can understand that a company that's sort of established and successful, a self-employed person who's into their groove will be accustomed to doing that on a monthly basis. And are we as confident that people starting out will have the same wherewithal at their disposal? Yeah. And as corollary to that, have you carried out any analysis on the cost and benefits of extending the start-up period beyond 1 year?
Well, perhaps if I can take the initial point about how easy it is. So in preparation for this committee, Mr. Chairman, I got to have a look at the screen and what you would need to do to enter. And that actually, I'm sure other committee members may have done this anyway, but you enter your earnings for that month, and then there is a box for costs, and there is a box for costs related to any vehicles you've used, and there is a prompt that you can use to tell you what are allowable costs. And I mean, that's basically it. So it is quite a sort of simple system to use.
We're basically asking, what are you living on? Or what did you live on last month? We're not deeply interested in the kinds of things that HMRC are interested in. We're not trying to judge their tax liability here at all. And the other thing I'd urge the committee just to bear in mind is, for tax credits, about 10% of the tax credit population who say they're self-employed have employed earnings. And if you think that in universal credit in the household you might have a partner who is working and is employed, and mixing oil and water here between an annual assessment and a monthly assessment would just build in such complexity I actually wouldn't know how to do it. So that's why we've moved to this monthly approach, because claimants' lives are not as simple as I'm self-employed or I'm employed. They're often mixed. And our own data from our first few self-employed people we've got in universal credit suggests employed might be running at about 15% as well.
Alex, can I take you back to that other question that Alex asked? And that was, had you considered extending the 1 year start-up period, please?
No, I mean, currently I think our view is that 1 year makes sense. And I would just say, Chairman, is that, of course, it is possible for certain businesses to have almost 2 years without a MIF, because, if you have been working on a business and you arrive within a year to claim universal credit, you can then get effectively an extra year. So I think what we have tried to do is to make sure there is support available for people through the NEA and through the specialist work coaches that we have to get them the support so they can grow their business.
So the answer is no.
I think the answer is no.
Great.
Yes.
Thank you. Emma?
Just to make a point that I've been listening to before I ask my question, there seems to be an assumption that everybody self-employed is running a business, and of course a lot of people who are self-employed are working for people who are running a business, so they have no control over fallow times or whatever you want to call it, and growing a business because they're working for them. But just to make that point. Understanding the stated rationale behind the surplus earnings rules, what evidence is there that self-employed people and employees seek to manipulate their earnings in a way that justifies it?
Well, I think if I may sort of look at it in a slightly different way in terms of surplus earnings, it's actually a recognition of the fact that, and there will be businesses out there and individuals out there who will have earnings which are lumpy, if I can put it like that, where the profile is not even throughout the year, and they will budget. They will make sure that they are covering their costs throughout the year. So the whole point of surplus earnings is that actually you can also sort of offset your losses as well. The intention is to make sure that we are being fair ultimately to the taxpayer as well. If you are getting a big increase in earnings in a particular month, then clearly what we are looking to do with this system is to apportion that down until you're able to get access to universal credit again.
I understand that. I understand the rationale behind it. It's whether or not, do we have evidence whether or not people are actually are abusing the system? I don't know. Is there any data available on that?
Well, Ms. Couling can perhaps sort of come in on this, but I would just say to you, just anecdotally, and please, this is literally an anecdote. I was at London Bridge a few days ago. I know some of the committee have visited, and we raised this issue of someone who wasn't on a MIF. There was a couple of cases. One, somebody who was about to receive £19,000, and obviously under the current system would then get universal credit for subsequent months. Somebody else with a sort of higher receipt. So I can offer you sort of anecdotal evidence, but I think that the whole principle of it is, at least the way I can see it, is not necessarily about mitigating fraud, but it's actually about what is fair and how other businesses operate and individuals operate who are not getting universal credit.
So this is being tightly monitored, is it?
Yeah, so can I evidence that for the committee, because you may not have picked up on this yet, but the surplus earnings provisions don't come in until April 18, so we haven't operated a surplus earnings policy yet with universal credit. And the Social Security Advisory Committee has been quite nervous around this policy area, urging us to look very carefully. So in the regulations we laid on Monday, they include provision in the first year of this policy to set the de minimis not at £300 but at £2,500 a month. And that will allow us to see what the impact of this policy is and see what the prevalence of the kind of surplus earning situations are for both self-employed and employed people in the economy. We clearly modelled this based on data from the Family Resources Survey, but it's actual data from RTI, which will be the helpful thing for the employed to do, and then in terms of how self-employed people are reporting to us. We only have at the moment on universal credit about 10,000 people who are self-employed, and some of those are not gainfully self-employed either under our definitions. So we don't have enough of a sample size yet to really do proper modelling around this, but we are committed. We've said to the Social Security Advisory Committee, we're committed to looking at this policy and see how it operates, because some of the points they make, it could go badly wrong for claimants, so we don't want that to happen.
And if I may just add to that, Chairman, is that I think the whole process in universal credit is about sort of test and learn, we will reflect on what we learn in the process and see how this actually operates as more people come onto the system.
Yeah.
And can Ruth come in, and then Heidi?
Thank you. Thank you for that answer, Minister. Can I ask how the department will be monitoring the impact of universal credit on self-employed claimants. We heard in our previous session last week that whilst usually around 70% of supported businesses will last past 15 months, then those on universal credit, only about 20% of them have actually survived past those 15 months. So it's obviously an issue of concern for the department, for people who are self-employed and looking to set up a business and grow it into something that makes wealth and employs more people. So how is that impact both of universal credit as a whole, then of the minimum income floor, which is a third higher than the actual average earnings being assessed, and then surplus earnings?
Well, so I mean, let me just reiterate, Ms. Ruth, that from our perspective, if somebody wants to be self-employed, we want to help them along that route. So we have specialist work coaches that people will come in to see. They will be able to signpost people onto the NEA, so there will be a process of mentoring. If you haven't yet sort of reached your MIF in your first year, you will go in every quarter and have a discussion with your work coach about what can be done to improve your earnings. And actually, my experience, we're talking to people at London Bridge, was that actually quite a lot of the work coaches, incredibly dedicated, they will quite often see those business owners more than every quarter, if that's what is required. So I think in terms of the whole process of sort of monitoring, that goes on within the job centre itself. I don't know whether Neil you want to know.
And we've committed to a specific piece of evaluation around the operation of the minimum income floor, given the points that you make, Mr. George, and others have made about how is it operating and will it be achieving what we hope it will do in terms of poverty reduction. And we will, as we do with all our research that's conducted, we will publish that. Now, before you get overexcited and demand it in the next 3 months of me, which is often an experience I get, not just from this committee, you had the Scottish Government in earlier asking for data, is we need enough self-employed claimants under the MIF in which to conduct the research before we can do that. But we will make the research public when we have done it.
Yes. Absolutely.
I did have some target dates for this, but of course we altered the rollout plans for universal credit in the light of the need to implement the budget changes, which the committee was very engaged in, and the last time I was here. So I don't have a specific date. I can tell the committee when I think we'll be launching the study and then how long it will take to complete. But we will do this because it's clearly a topic of great interest to people.
Well, you haven't got a date to do the research. You have implemented the budget changes, or have you not implemented?
No, the regulations we laid on Monday allow for the waiting days change to come in from the 14th of February, and the transition to UC housing payment comes in from the start of April, as do the changes to temporary accommodation. It also includes some other provisions, which I mentioned the surplus earnings change.
I thought the original announcement said it was coming in the obviously February is in the new year.
Yeah, so we thought
we were led to believe it was coming in earlier.
Well, the advances.
So advances came in from the start of January, the 3rd of January.
But the other budget changes happened.
The changes to how we've been treating the private rented sector in terms of trying to pull people over who have the equivalent of the alternative payment arrangements, they came in before December. So I've been phasing those in as quickly as I can, but I had to alter the rollout plans because effectively it's displaced work that would allow me to go back to scale in February to May. So it has shifted things along. I'm not being evasive here. The thing does alter. I need enough people to conduct samples on.
Before Heidi comes in then, Alok, given that you've got the power to call a halt in January, given the timescale that Neil tells you he needs to implement the budget changes, but coming back to what Jean told us from a Scottish minister, about the difficulty of trying to administer a benefit when it's changing. Have you thought of actually using that fire break to actually say we'll cease rollout until Neil's accomplished the budget changes?
Well, I think, Chair, what we have done, as far as I've understood, is that we have changed the profile and slowed down the implementation of universal credit. So I hope that will make a difference. But I mean, I think we both hear what you're saying, and let's sort of reflect on the point about when the piece of work on the self-employed, on the impact of the MIF can start, and how long that study may take.
Good point from Steve, and then to Heidi. Steve?
I just wondered, I was just listening to Mr. Couling there, and he said you'll start the research when you've got a big enough sample. How big does the sample need to be to give you some confidence?
Well, what I'd like to be able to assure is that when because we'll randomly assign people to the study, and I want to try and get a good range of various different types of self-employment, because I think Ms. Denko mentioned self-employment is a great shorthand, but in fact the range of activities that people are engaged in, you've got some kind of high-end entrepreneurs at one end, they tend to be quite a small number actually, and you've got contractors, people working in a way that almost resembles employment. It's something the committee's looked at before. And then you've got sole traders, painting and decorating, gardening and the like. So it's quite a broad range.
Sure.
And
I just wondered, I mean, you've obviously been giving this a lot of thought, so you must have a figure in your head that says that would be the optimum sample. I just wondered...
I forget what the I should be able to remember this, what the analysts advise is a safe sample size. But
you have that information. I mean, presumably if you're preparing and planning for this, you don't recall it now, I accept that, but is that something you could send us so that we could know where you are and what you're aiming for?
More generally, we've put out to consultation what our evaluation strategy should be, because we are in receipt of a number of questions and things. I'd like to know this, I'd like to know that. So we decided that there were so many coming in, we can't meet everybody's requests.
So there's in existence a brief for your evaluation, which you'll share with us.
And I want to update the strategy as well, because when we set the strategy back in 2012, 2013, what we thought would be the interesting things aren't now being replicated back at us as terms of things that people are interested in. For example, if you want to go to your previous witnesses...
Neil, we don't keep going off from there. Okay. Neil, Steve has asked a specific point. Yeah. You must have some idea, mustn't you, the size of the sample, and when you think you will reach that size. And if we could have that information, that would be really helpful. Yeah.
So, Chairman, I will write to you.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you very much. Heidi.
Include whether the people on self-employment continue in self-employment, as well as your evaluation of minimum income floor.
Well, exactly. We're interested in how do they respond to the minimum income floor? Do they effectively up their hours, which is one response? Do they take on some part-time work to effectively support their self-employment? Or do they exit self-employment and go into employment?
Heidi?
Well, there are 750,000 unfilled vacancies in the economy, so Neil, there is a good chance they'll go into
we're going to get the note. Heidi?
Thank you. So, from very detailed questions, this is now the big one, Alok, for you. The whole heart of universal credit. Work allowances and the taper rate are not where they were when the system was designed. What's your view on what that has done or will still do in terms of changing incentives to work?
Yeah. Well, I think in a way, coming into this sort of new, what's been very important for me is to look at, what was the system in place before, so the legacy system, some of which is obviously benefits are still operating, and what is the system that we have now. And clearly what you have got in tax credits, for instance, is
effectively. Not so much interested in the old system. This is about
universal credit. Absolutely. No, I understand that. But what I'm trying to say is that what we've tried to do with universal credit is to make sure that it's simple in the sense that for every extra hour you do, you get more money in the pocket.
Absolutely,
Right.
and we would all agree with that.
Yeah. And in terms of the taper rate, I mean, as you will know, in April last year, it went from 65 to 63%. I mean, the cost of that to the Exchequer was 600 million in a steady state. So, you know, again, it's a question of if you reduce that, you know, could you do it? Well, yes, theoretically, of course you can. Ultimately, it comes down to a question of, you know, the cost that's associated with it. And in terms of...
But I'm just interested really in comparing to how the system was designed when IDS originally put it together. It was a very different system. Both the work allowances and the taper rate have changed considerably. And yes, we all understand it's very expensive to put that back in again. And we're grateful for the 2% shift to the taper rate. But is it enough to still act as this big you know, machine to incentivise people to go into work and take more hours?
Well, I think the system has shown that actually under universal credit more people are in work and they're staying
But that's
and work
single
longer.
uncomplicated claimants without children.
I'm sorry?
That's single, what I call uncomplicated, no health issues, single people without children. We don't have the data yet for people
Well, sure.
with families
and
with disabilities.
those people will be sort of coming onto the system and then they're migrating the system. I mean, you talked about work allowance rates as well. I mean, from they have been frozen for a number of years. From April this year, they are going up by 3 percentage points. But ultimately, from our perspective, you know, you can flex either. There is a cost element to it, and I think one could argue that actually in a economic environment where there are lots of jobs out there and people have an opportunity to increase their hours, perhaps flexing the taper rate is the appropriate thing to do, if that's what you want to do. And actually in a job market where you know, jobs are more scarce, actually incentivizing people to try and find a job, you know, you might want to flex the work allowances. But yeah, ultimately, there is a cost associated with any change that we make.
Can I just comment
Yeah,
on that? I mean, IDS fought very hard against the Chancellor making the changes to his original scheme. He therefore must have had a very helpful brief from the department on what the effect of the previous Chancellor, George Osborne's changes would be, and the numbers easily moving into work. Have you been shown that document?
I have not seen those documents, but I mean, what I have seen is the analysis that actually, you know, compared to the legacy systems, you know, more people are working and they're staying in work longer, which I think is, you know, the right thing in terms of
incentives. Is that from the simple
incentives.
system or the rollout of the more complicated system, if we can simplify it in that way?
Well, I can ask Neil if he wants to comment on that, but I mean, since we're talking about principles, I think as a principle it does appear to be working. I completely understand that you know, the more complicated cases aren't necessarily have all come on, and there will be sort of migration that takes place. But I just go back to the point that there is, what we've now also got is claimants being able to get this sort of personalised support through their work coaches, which hopefully helps them in tackling any barriers that they have getting into work and getting more work.
I mean, I'm quite bullish about the more complicated cases as you described them, in terms of them coming into the system, because the easiest cases from a benefits perspective are actually the hardest from a labour market perspective, because job seekers allowance is already one of the most effective labour market regimes in the world. So doing better than that, I think, encourages me that when I come to look at the other cases, they will show a similar gain.
Yeah,
and if it helps the committee,
When will
I've
we
done
know
a
that,
detailed
Neil?
piece for Baroness
Neil,
Hollis.
when will we know that your confidence is properly placed?
I may start annoying you, Chair, about this, but I need enough cases in the sample size
And
and a way of comparing, because in the...
When's that going to occur, Neil? When will you have your sample?
Well, it's not just a sample size problem. I was going to go on and explain that you know, we do a matching exercise for job seekers allowance and universal credit for the so-called simple cases, so single unemployed people. My analysts are not certain yet whether a similar matching approach will work for other claimant characteristics, because we've got to pull data from places that is not easily accessible to us, like
a
tax
desperately
credit
naive
world.
question might well be then, if the department was, or that we decided to fundamentally change the main levers of universal credit, i.e. the work allowance and the taper rate, but we didn't have any known analysis techniques for how we were going to work out what effect that would have on claimants. That seems to me not terribly well prepared.
So, no, what I was about to offer before the Chair asked me a slightly different question, as is right, was I did a sort of detailed analysis for Baroness Hollis because she asked me about the 250,000 extra people we think will go into work as a result of universal credit. I'm very happy to provide that for the committee for you to see and reflect on.
Thank you.
I suppose my final kind of conclusion question, Alok, to you is, so I was really pleased, as I'm sure everybody on the committee was. It was a quieter delivered message, not quite the trumpet at the dispatch box in the autumn budget, but the Chancellor, in addition to reducing the waiting days and some of the other changes he made, he also did say he would keep taper rate under review, which I think is very, very sensible.
Very sure.
What's your view on that? And what data or what sort of market intelligence would it take for you to be questioning, yes, is the time right to cut that taper rate further?
So, I mean, the whole issue of the taper rate, I know, has been a discussion point kind of since this whole welfare reform started. I think perhaps the way that I can put it is that, as the Chancellor said, we keep this under review as we keep other policies under review. And from a universal credit point of view, the one thing that is very clear is that we're testing stuff, we're learning from it, and then we're reacting to it. So you saw the budget announcements, and I think that was a process of listening and reacting. So I would just say to you that we keep all of this under review. But what I can't offer you at the committee today is some definitive view on when, if taper rates are going to come down in the future.
No, it's what sort of things will you be keeping, what sort of data will you be demanding of Neil? What kind of questions will you be asking yourself to allow you to reach regular conclusions about whether the taper rate is set at the right amount or not?
Well, I think it will be, Neil's obviously going to share the reports on the extra 250,000 people who will be in work as a result of universal credit. So I would want to have a look at that in detail, and then actually try and understand what are the sort of incentives that want to make people either increase their hours or indeed get into paid work in the first place.
Alok, when do you think you'll have enough information from Neil to produce a business case for this benefit?
I'm sorry, Joe.
We're still waiting to have news that you've completed a business case for this benefit. When do you think you'll have enough information from Neil so you'll be able to submit a business case to the Treasury and to other bodies as well? We'd obviously like to see that business
Well,
case.
sure. Maybe I can ask Neil to answer when that information is available.
So a plan is to complete the full business case in the spring, we've said, probably be around March. And at that point, I've committed to write to Meg Hillier as the Chair of the Public Accounts Committee, setting out the difference between our last business case, which was an outline business case, and this one. I'd be very happy, I think we made this promise in a response back to you, to share that analysis with the committee as well.
When was that outline business case made?
The outline business case was settled in September 2015.
Right. And you would then expect the updated one, the
Yes.
real product?
So there's a process of business cases to be that the Treasury require of major programmes. So it's not unusual to go through this process because the Treasury use it as a lever on which to effectively expenditure control. So unless I satisfy the next stage of the business case process, they withdraw funding from me.
Yes, so it's actually rather crucial.
It is, yes.
So, yeah, indeed. Very good. Steve?
I just want to ask a couple of questions about people with disabilities. And I just wondered if you could just give the committee the rationale for excluding severe and enhanced disability premium from universal credit, and what calculations the department have done. I've obviously seen the calculations that other people have done, but what calculations the department have done on the likely effect of that decision?
So I think, I hope the committee will accept that the various different benefits related to disability had become quite a sort of complex framework. And, successive governments did that with the best of intentions, of course, so not a criticism in that sense. But I think what we want to do on the universal credit was to simplify and rationalise the current system. And it's been modelled on ESA. And the intention has always been that this will be reformed in a way that the most severely disabled get the support that they need. So if you look at the entitlement, it is substantially higher than the current support component in ESA. Now, I know, and just to say, Mr. McCabe, that in terms of people who are managed migrated onto universal credit, they will be protected. We've made that point. I completely accept, I think the point that you're alluding to is that if somebody naturally migrates, that will have an impact on them. I think it's actually quite difficult to estimate how many people this might affect. I mean, just intuitively, I would think that a lot of those who are getting the severe disability premium right now will be managed migrated. But I do understand the point you're making, and I think it's something that certainly I want to reflect on.
The figures that I've seen suggest that the number of people we're talking about could range between about 200,000 and 500,000, and that people could lose up to £3,000 per year. Do you think that's possible, or do you reject those figures?
Well, I mean, Neil will be sort of closer to this in terms of the figures themselves. But the point I would make is that I think it is quite difficult to actually come up with estimates. But to your sort of fundamental point that you're making is, what happens to those who naturally migrate. I want to reflect on what this committee says and what's sort of being said generally about this matter.
Thanks.
I was glad for the committee's understanding. Just the comparison in support rates between employment support allowance and universal credit. It's £168 a month in ESA, and it's £318 a month in universal credit. And that will ultimately, when fully rolled out, go to 2.2 million people in the total UC population. It's
that's the good big figure that the department uses. I understand that, but I'm trying to ask about the people who could be losers, because I mean, obviously, that's the bit that we're concerned about.
I was asking the committee to bear both in mind.
Yeah, no, I accept the first point
without the
absolutely.
other.
But can you give me any further information on the losers? I mean, that's the bit I'm trying to just kind of focus on. I understand why you quote that figure, and it is useful to hear it. But is it true that there are at least 200,000 people who could be losers? And is it true that there are figures showing they could lose up to £3,000 per year?
It seems to be, I keep going on about the trickiness of modelling, so you'll probably never have me back
you've been doing it for a long time, so you can surely tell me that.
Yeah, but the thing I'd emphasise is that the vast majority of people, I suspect, will be managed migrated and will get transitional protection, so they won't be a loser under that definition. What I can't do today is give you a precise figure about exactly how many people are going to naturally migrate and how many people are managed migrate.
Are there any calculations on that in the department? I mean, did anybody model that sort of thing? You were quite bullish a second ago when you told me the good news. I'm not trying to be difficult, but to be fair and have balance, we have to hear the other side also.
No, you're not being difficult at all, Mr. McCabe.
No, I'm not trying to be difficult. I'm just trying to understand.
Yeah. No, the trickiness is trying to adjudge how many cases will naturally migrate, and that's the thing.
Are you saying there's been no work done on that?
There's high-level work on natural migrations, but not at a granularity that will allow you to identify a component of somebody's benefit. here.
So
Because
can
we've
I-
got three benefits in which the severe disability premium can be paid: job seekers allowance, employment support allowance, and income support.
But is
We've
the
got
position
interactions between the
Is
three.
the position at the moment that we're relying on your experience and confidence to assure the Minister on this, or do you have some figures that lead you to have that confidence?
Well, I think as the Minister says,
that's the crux of what I'm trying to get out of you.
we're reflecting on this. What I'm saying is I can't give him at the moment a
don't
precise
know.
idea
You
of the exact number
don't
of people
know at
we
the
think
moment.
will be affected. But I return to the fact that I think the vast majority will manage migrate over, so will not be losers in the. So we will not be at
But you
500,000.
don't know at the moment, is that
We won't
right?
be at 500,000 losers of cash, definitely.
But you don't know.
But I don't
at the
know the
moment.
exact.
What's the length of life of somebody who does transfer over and has got protection for doing so? How long does that protection last, and when would they actually then become losers?
So we've not yet published the regulations about this, but I hope to do so later on this year. But the intention is that it's not a time-limited approach. So much in the same way that when we moved from supplementary benefit to income support in 1988, we're probably only two people who can remember this, Mr. Field, there was the transitional protection continued until it was eroded out over the effects of uprating across time. So there's no time limiting on the protection we're going to be offering.
Really good. Thank you very much.
Affected by a change of circumstances, though, as all the other managed migrations will be.
So potentially it is affected by some limited changes of circumstances, but in general, it's the increase in your core entitlement that erodes the transitional protection, not the fact that something else has changed around your kind of characteristics. We would need to go through the regulations together for me to give you a precise answer on a specific circumstance or not. But in general, we want the erosion to occur by increases in entitlement, so people don't see a cash difference.
Supplementary benefits, if we go back that far, that protection was lost when your circumstances changed.
Yes, in certain circumstances, but not in every circumstance.
Well, in most of them.
Well, not
Yeah,
well.
We'll see.
We'll go back to
if ever we get this data. All right, very good. It's Heidi then, Ruth.
Thank you. So another kind of big conceptual question, one of the benefits of universal credit was this whole smooth transition in and out of work and no cliff edges, the 16-hour cliff edge we had in the old system. Excuse me. However, I think man flu is doing the rounds, isn't it? I think, but there are some benefits.
What's going to fall off the wall?
Don't even go there, Frank. Some fast-forwarded benefits that perhaps weren't thought about, really, in terms of how they would be integrated universal credit. The hot one that everybody's talking about at the moment, of course, is free school meals. There are other ones, prescription charges. But just interested in your view in the proposals we have under consultation at the moment, for example. We're going to have another cliff edge, aren't we, with free school meals, and what's your view on that?
Yeah. So, I think ultimately passported benefits are decided on by individual departments, and I mean the chairman was a senior minister in government, and I'm sure at the time he would also have felt it's rather odd if the DWP or another department was effectively making policy for other departments. So this has been something for other departments to consider, and I think the principle of it, I think, is to make sure that those people who broadly are getting those benefits now will continue to get those benefits under universal credit. Now, going to the point about free school meals, I think the calculation that's been done is that on a net basis, 50,000 extra children will benefit with a change to universal credit. And of course, if you are getting a free school meal now under universal credit, you will continue to get that until you finish that phase of your education. But I mean, you're right. There is a potential for a cliff edge. I think we've thought about this. I think the only way that you could potentially avoid a cliff edge is effectively monetising the free school meal, and then of course there is a risk that not every child will get that free school meal if it's monetised. So I mean, I understand this is a concern that you raise, but we have given this quite a lot of thought, and I think the net effect of the changes based on the consultation and based on the level that's suggested of earning £7,400, the impact would be 50,000 more children getting it. But clearly, the DFE will want to reflect and come forward with their thoughts following the consultation.
Just that there are technical limitations, aren't there, within universal credit, dynamic as it is, to deal with lumps like this. And we can't. How can we? Could we have designed it better?
It is. So when we were looking at universal credit, these were some of the issues we worked through, and we looked at the value of a warm meal in the middle of the day for 1.1 million of children from the poorest families, and concluded that was a better outcome than the work disincentives. And in fact, when the Social Security Advisory Committee looked at this in 2012, they could not find any research evidence that showed an actual work disincentive associated with passported benefits. So that made us think, in the weighing up of this, that the warm meal was a better outcome
of that.
rather than a perfectly smooth tapering here.
So in this debate going on in government, you're saying that you're arguing for those who are on universal credit to continue to be able to claim free school dinners.
Yes, and the consultation proposal gives transitional protection to anybody getting it. There's also transitional protection to anybody getting it on universal credit now, which is an extra thing, and extends to another 50,000 children the help of free school meals. So we definitely didn't want any retreat from that, and in fact we've got some improvement on that, so we're quite pleased about the consultation.
I'm pleased to hear that. So those who are on universal credit, who've got children at school, will be eligible for free school dinners?
Yes.
And can I? That's good, really good news.
But this is up to an income threshold.
There's a debate over the income threshold. Under the existing scheme, local authorities could use their information on who was eligible for housing benefit, data which you now have, to actually automatically passport children for the school premium. Now, will you be negotiating, or not negotiating, but inviting local authorities to be able to use your data in passporting to the school premium? Because in matters of budgets for schools in poor areas, it's a very sizable sum indeed.
Yeah.
So so as I don't work for the Department for Education, so if I get any of this wrong, I'll write to you.
Yeah.
But my understanding is that the free school meal acts as a trigger,
Indeed.
and they use the free school meal data from us, so our benefit entitlement information to do all of that. So that information will continue to be passed to the Department for Education at the level at which they set. This 7,400 earnings threshold is what's proposed. And I'm not aware of councils being able to use housing benefit data in that way. I think it might be that everybody's talking about DWP data into Department for Education, but I will check, because I say this is not my specialist subject.
Housing data is passporting. If you're on housing benefit, you're also eligible for free school dinners and a premium. And those authorities who've done it automatically, giving families the opt-out, I mean, Wirral has done this, it's £750,000 extra for schools.
As it isn't my specialist subject, may I investigate and come back to you?
Come back to us on that?
Definitely.
It's the whole dynamic as the system's changing, isn't it? How will that information automatically flow? Because
we need to try and strengthen your hand to raise that threshold for free school dinners, don't we?
Their income varies between months. It will make it a nightmare.
Well, no, I think the system works the way in which, if you qualify for the free school meal, you then the pupil premium and so forth follows you through. So I don't think it's a fluctuation problem, but I will check this housing benefit point, because it's a new one on me, Chair.
Yes, thank you.
Just the last kind of concluding point, really, just reflecting, Alok, on what you said there. And I know it is like this, that government departments often don't seem to talk to each other, and it's a bit silo-like. But, you have the potential for this phenomenal, smooth machine in universal credit, and yet other departments and their decisions around things, passport or benefits like free school meals, potentially risk the benefit that is to be had from universal credit by creating these cliff edges. And I know free school meals is just one example of that, and I can understand the logic of the greater good and why you decided in the process to go the way you have. But shouldn't you be working harder with other departments so that your machine isn't damaged as a consequence?
Yes. So we are. Now, please, I didn't want to give the impression that there's no joined-up government, because there is. So there are a team of officials, and Neil can elaborate if he likes, but there's a team of officials from different departments who are working together with us to make sure that as these changes are implemented, they are implemented in an efficient way throughout the universal credit system. So that is happening.
By cash value, free school meals is the biggest one of the passported benefits, but they range from everything almost towards fishing licences at the complete opposite end of the kind of thing here. So there's a cross-departmental committee. I convened it in 2011 to start looking at all this. And from a design of universal credit point of view, which was what I was responsible for back then, the thing I realised was we couldn't monetise all of this. It would just be impossible. So the thing that we've sort of carefully arranged from a DWP perspective is that there's no one point at which all the passported benefits run out. So essentially, if we are creating these little cliff edges, and I said the Social Security Advisory Committee couldn't find a work disincentive effect of them, but if we were, we've smoothed it to the extent that the taper's got a little bit bumpy, rather than a huge cliff edge where all government policy is coalescing around. Yeah. So if you take, things like legal aid,
coming back to this on that, aren't you, Neil? Thank you.
Yeah, but would it also help if I wrote and showed you where the different decisions are by different departments that kind of say that out? There is logic behind the way in which we've approached this, but as the Minister says, these are not specific policies that ministers in DWP can dictate now, right?
No, we might be able to speed some of them up. Very good. Ruth, a last question?
Thank you. There's obviously a lot of concern about the impact of universal credit on poverty rates and predictions that a million extra children will fall into poverty due to the policy. The predecessor Secretary of State who set up universal credit told the House in October that universal credit flags up when somebody has a debt problem and when they're running into arrears. If that's the case, then maybe one of you would be able to tell us how many people are currently flagged up under universal credit as having a debt problem and how many are in arrears, please.
So, I mean, it's difficult to interpret the comments of others, but my understanding when he said that was we're effectively with universal credit uncovering things that were always there in the system. So, for example, if you take rent arrears, what is interesting when you look at the rent arrears situations is the level of pre-existing rent arrears is quite high in the housing benefit kind of caseload. And this came out most recently when the National Housing Federation produced a set of data on the arrears in their particular sector. So I think what my former Secretary of State was saying was talking about that, not that my system sits there and I'm sitting on a load of data showing me all the debts that people have got, because I'm not sitting on that kind of information.
I mean, just to make one point in addition to this, so looking at the debt that people have got, so as people migrate onto the system, particularly people who are on tax credits, I mean, there's sort of stock debt of around £4 billion right now as a result of overpayments and people not being able to pay back on time. So that will then come onto our system once they are managed migrated on. So that debt won't be because of universal credit. That will be historic debt that was created because of other policy decisions that were made.
I think that's actually sounds very different to what the previous Secretary of State was saying when he was talking about universal support and the fact that that ought to be going hand in hand with universal credit. Can you tell the committee what the arrangements are for universal support where it does become apparent that there are debt problems and how it will trigger if that's not being flagged up?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if I can just say in terms of universal credit, universal support, there is, of course, support with personal budgeting. Right now, we've now moved on to a system, of course you can also get digital support, but we've now moved on to a system in 17-18 where the amount of money that we are making available to local authorities to deliver this support is grant-based. That wasn't necessarily the case historically. And I think what has allowed us to do is from April this year, we've been able to get information and gather information. So basically the amount of information flow is much better. So we can see how many people are getting and making use of universal support, its various components. And there is, in fact, a sort of deep dive, to use a Whitehall phrase, that is going on right now of universal support. And clearly in the sort of coming period, we will then make sure that we publish any recommendations coming from that.
Presumably from your response, there's local authorities who aren't implementing universal support, and that's certainly some of the evidence that this committee has received is that they've had no guidelines around it. And it's done because it's done at a district authority level, it's actually very difficult to manage things like digital support where they don't have resources.
Yeah, so around over 360 local authorities have now made use of this. So, it may be the local authority providing it. If I give you an example, Mr. George, I went to the local job centre in Reading, which is next to my constituency, in that particular case, the local council, Reading Borough Council, provides that support. There will be other places where it will be citizens' advice, a credit union, it may be a local housing association that's providing advice. I think one of the things that we've learned already is that the best way of getting this support to people is to have it in-house. So you have those people providing support based in the job centre, and you can literally signpost someone and say, look, we really think you should go and talk to that person. So I certainly think that's one way of improving its effectiveness. Chair, in the autumn when we announced the package of £1.5 billion, the former Secretary of State also said that we would be having conversations with Citizens' Advice about how we could help people on universal credit in terms of advice and other help. And that is a dialogue that we are continuing to have with Citizens' Advice.
Very good. Thank you very much for appearing today, and thank you for the offers of new data. We look forward to receiving it.
Thank you, Chair.